Hi, everyone. This is a recording for the game design studio, and this will be the second recording in an ongoing series. Today, we're going to focus mainly on production, and I have a game industry professional here to answer some questions about that for us. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi all. My name is Jia-Ling. I am a producer with Apex Legends right now. I currently handle the Legends pipeline for release of Apex Legends. I'm originally from Malaysia. I used to be a concept artist. That was actually my art track in past, and I moved overseas to Hong Kong and the UK to expand on that skill set and worked in those places for a little bit. And then I came to the US to do an MFA in visual development. Sometime after I finished the MFA in my visual development, I actually pivoted track to do production for various reasons we'll probably get into. And I've worked for various mobile companies. I would say my speciality is the fact that I have covered almost all aspects of a live ops game. By live operations, meaning that a game that has to be run concurrently with the user experience, as opposed to a single experience game where you release it and then maybe you have a DLC, maybe you have a patch, right? So I've worked with companies like Storm8. I've worked with Big Fish Casino, which is a social casino game under the mobile space. I've worked with Glue, and I've worked on the core tech and the back end pieces of handling like SDKs and signings with Apple and whatnot. And now I'm working in a development, not live operations of Apex itself. And that was a choice on my part because I wanted to step away from handling the kerfuffle of live operations. And that's where we're at.
Yeah, live ops is a scramble. I spent
Some people
most
thrive
of
in
the
it.
time. Yeah, I spent most of my professional time doing a game that was releasing a 4-hour chunk of content
Oh,
bi-monthly for 8 years. There were problems with their development model, but
oh yeah, that would
for
do it.
another time.
Mhm.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you came in as a concept artist and
Mhm.
that now you're working in production. Can you speak a little bit about what you thought your career trajectory was going to be when you entered, right? When you decided to become a game designer, where did you
Yeah.
think you were going? And then what happened to make you decide to change that? And how did you actually what enabled you to make that transition? Because art to
Mm.
production is not the most common shift
No.
that I've seen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of times, though, if I look back, so English is my second language. A lot of how I learned English was through books, to games, especially, and being multilingual that really helped the experience. And games like Final Fantasy had a really huge impact on the artistic want. I've always been an artist, right? And that was kind of the aim. But what things people don't realize is that the industry in both grossly overgeneralizing, the West and East is actually quite different. And so when you come from the East with a certain set of expectations of how you will be a concept artist or a character designer, et cetera, et cetera. In Malaysia, I only worked in a games design company, so to speak, right? For a bit, but I mostly worked in agency and most of the other pieces were freelance. So it gave you a very different perspective. So what I wanted to do was do visual development, which America does do. But initially, because art tracks from Malaysia into the US is actually quite rare. It's very expensive and it requires a certain type of scholarship. I actually got to the UK first. And when I was there, the visual design of the UK is very, very different, right? The expectation, the industry, even in games itself, was very different. And even back then, I could tell that with Brexit happening, I was likely not going to be able to stay, even if to work a couple years. This was many, many years ago, but there were inklings of it. Being an immigrant, being a foreign student, there are certain things I had to weigh in terms of, like, if I can't stay and I can't get that experience, all right, where can I take the leftover of the scholarship to go? So I moved over to the US to do an MFA, right, in visual development. And it sort of was a relearning of what the expectations of the US industry was. And over time, one of the reasons I changed is also because it's not that I didn't thrive creatively. I think many people in school underestimate the kind of pressure you can be in when you've worked in so many of those spaces, and studied it for so many times and relearned it, the kind of creative burnout that you can have, right? And I will openly say that one of the main reasons I moved into production was because when I moved into the industry and worked for a bit as an artist, I was handled by very poor producers. And nothing is more painful as an artist to be handled by a producer who doesn't understand your pipeline. And arguably, depending on the studio that you're in, and hopefully none of you go into studios like that, artists are not commonly treated very well and are also not commonly paid well unless you are of a specific ilk and on specific sectors of the industry, right? And I got very annoyed because I have a more like workflow oriented mind. So I was like, okay, you know what, I'm going to do this because this is nonsense, and also you're creatively burning me out. And also frankly speaking, depending on the art groups that you have, I think it is very lucky, and you should keep the people who are very supportive. I unfortunately was with a group of people that were not very supportive in the concept space, and it was actually very competitive to the point that it was creatively draining. I was just like running on fumes at the point by the time I was done with my MFA. So I had to balance the question of like, I do want to be in the games industry. There's always been the dream, there's always been the aim, right? But does it have to be art? And that's a very difficult question to ask someone who is creatively inclined, because a lot of people view the perception as like you're a sellout, right? But quite frankly, while the shift was painful, I chose the track partially because it was more stable. Because being an immigrant, like you need the stable job to be able to get the work visa, etc. You were more stable, you were more valued at the time, and I hate saying that because it's obviously not the case, but those were the cards that I mentioned, right? And it also allowed me an ability to flex the fact that I was multilingual, because many production pieces in this space. So how I got into it was because I actually took the track of handling the outsourcing. Right. So because I worked in Malaysia, Malaysia is one of the developing nations that handles a lot of outsourcing houses, for better or worse. You might have seen certain things with certain companies, right? But the difference is the difficulty for a lot of Americans that were working in that space is that culturally they didn't understand how to convey information. Even though people understand English, like it's not the way that they pass. And so I didn't use the home language or the home languages that I could use or the cultural languages, but I could understand like, oh, this is what they're misunderstanding, and I've used that as a flex to be able to do that on top of the fact that I had art skills. So that means if they couldn't do it, I could go in and go do it myself, right? Putting yourself in the outsourcing pipeline allowed me to be closer in proximity to the development. And that's how I negotiated going into development, because you need to be part of the development pipeline to understand when to get outsourcing requests, because it's not just an artist that you can have on call and have those paces, and artists will still dictate that. So you're still working in the creative space. And that's kind of how I massage, so to speak, my mentality of like, how do I move from being a fully on board creative to something that is more production oriented, more workflow oriented. And like also a part of it was like, how am I okay with that? Right? Because it is a conversation with myself. I spent so many years pursuing one aspect of the industry. How do I turn that back into what some people may view as a hobby? I do freelance quite a lot of art outside of my day job, quote unquote, because it brings me joy. And I think that was the thing that I came out of it, was that production gave me career fulfillment, but art away from the space, even though it will be wonderful to be like, I get to design an Apex Legends like champion, for example, right? I actually found more creative fulfillment away from putting it all into my career, because that was draining me, right? So that's kind of the track of how I got there. And then at some point I made the full jump to not do outsourcing anymore, and I just went full development.
Yeah, I think that that's something that is common from people I see, switching to production in particular. Is I worked in this part of the industry, and my producer was terrible, and so I decided to go into production, or producers were terrible, in order to do better at interfacing with my discipline. And so a lot of people who go to production from being programmers or
QA.
from being designers, or from being QA, are like, QA isn't used properly as part of our process, but so I'm going to go into production and do that part of it better. So I think that's a pretty common thing. I think it's important, your willingness to go wherever in the world in order to pursue what you wanted to pursue in the industry. And how broadly people are willing to relocate and travel varies. But for students who think that they're going to graduate and get a game design job in their hometown, that's pretty uncommon, right?
Yeah, fairly uncommon.
Your options really, severely by doing that.
Yeah.
You know,
And
I
I
did
will
manage.
say that I had a huge privilege of a pretty large scholarship budget, which is the only reason I actually was able to do that, because fundamentally my family did not have that kind of fund to do it for me myself. So it's
Yeah,
not even a privilege that many international students have at all times. Usually you pick one country and like you're there, you know, and
sure.
you're essentially
Absolutely.
there for a bit. But yes, I would say relocation, unfortunately, even in a post-COVID, not post-pandemic, but post-COVID world, is not uncommon
Mhm.
because of because of various things. This is a slightly different topic in terms of how you sign your contracts and why people allow certain places to be remote, but like just expect that there's some level of relocation you may have to do.
And the degree of support you have in managing that is going to vary depending on your position level, right?
Hmm.
If you're when you get to mid to senior level positions, then
Hmm.
relocation can be, you know, quite a perk in
Yeah.
terms of the amount of support you have to move there and find
Hmm.
new housing, that
Yeah.
kind of thing.
I would
If
say
when you're
so.
starting out, you
Yeah.
know, that may not be the case. It may be
Yeah.
like, well, if you come to San Francisco, you can work for us, but
Yeah.
like we'll see you when you arrive. And you know, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that nowadays, like, I would just assume they don't have a relocation budget, right? Even if you're mid to senior sometimes, because the assumption is that you'll get perhaps a signing bonus if you negotiated that, and that will be what you would use to go, or that they would assume uh that you were already somewhere nearby, because a common thing that we don't do in our resumes, which I would highly recommend people don't do, is don't put your location, you know.
Sure. Yeah.
Because if you are willing to go without them having to relocate you, rather than them chopping you off the list, knowing that they don't have that budget, that is something to be to think about at the very least.
Particularly at an entry level, if
Hmm.
you're willing to do whatever to get there.
Yeah.
So the relocation is also going to depend on the size of the studio you're working
Hmm.
for, right? It's gonna be much
Yes.
more common if you're going to work for Microsoft. I, you know,
Hmm.
have friends who were just
Like
hired there.
Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, like the bigger companies, then you'll likely have it.
Yeah. But if you're working for an indie studio, it's unlikely. So, you know, what are you willing to do is a
Hmm.
good thing to have to be thinking about.
Hmm.
Awesome. Can you tell me specifically about what your job responsibilities are
Hmm.
for being a producer, particularly like
Hmm.
either in your current position, and then like how does that differ maybe from other producer positions you've
Mm.
had?
Okay, so currently what I'm doing, because I have to pre-state this, that I'm not handling the live operations, because Apex Legends as a game is just humongous. It's not necessarily the largest game, but it is the largest team I've ever been on. I would argue that the prior games I've done, the game's income, quote unquote, was so large that we had to manage it slightly differently. But in terms of its complexity, Apex is the largest. So when I say I handle the Legends pipeline, I really mean I handle the creation, the teams that handle the creation, the narrative, the game design, the track fully to put the legend out. But once the legend is live, the only live ops that I generally do is handle bugs that are very specific to those legends happening in the live space, and redelegating it to our game designers, but not in itself handling the day-to-day of like our crashes and whatnot. I respond to it with other producers who handle that, but there are producers that are specifically meant for the live operations handling of the store, the events, the stability and whatnot. And so that is not my current process. But in past, especially because I came from the mobile space as well, mobile is much more rapid. I would say the teams are much more lean, and the producers are expected to know further. So in mobile space, what my day-to-day was commonly, and it's not dissimilar with Apex, was that I would be handling sprints, I would be handling meetings, I'll be doing a lot of cross-discipline communication, I'll be making sure people are following up with their deadlines, I'll be making sure that our documentation is solid, and I would be making sure that we are still aligned on certain features and release pipelines. And in mobile, you had to handle all of that while also handling the live ops. And by live ops, it means that from the day to day, because let's say, for example, when I did Big Fish Casino, it is a social casino game. Our Tuesdays were always releases with new machines, with new tuning, oftentimes. But sometimes that means players can react, right? And sometimes the reaction can be bad. Sometimes our servers don't hold up. We have to have those expectations of what is the de-escalation, who's on call, not on call necessarily, but who is the person to talk to this week, who is releasing something, who's handling a hotfix, how are we handling the hotfix, do we have to reprioritize which team handles a hotfix, or can we piggyback with another release, stuff like that, right? So the day-to-day is a lot of negotiation, looking at the priorities, talking to stakeholders about new things, because your backlog is probably constantly growing, if anything, and deciding on the conversations of which are the most useful. And obviously business is business changes if it's a live operations game. I've actually never been in a game that isn't aimed for a live operations sort of state. With that, there is a negotiation of what can our teams handle coming down the pipe, and what do we need to move to make the needle move, be it for engagement or for income, and oftentimes it's both.
Great. So what size, if you can say, is the overall Apex Legend team, and what's the size of your the group of people that you're doing production for?
I want to say that the Apex Legends team across the world is probably like 700 people, or maybe 500, depending. In America, I would say it's probably 300 something. My role is quite unique in that I am a producer for teams that already have producers. I'm handling it like at such a high level, on also deep diving. So if I wanted to count it, my direct report people, I have 7. My overall team per legend, because I handle multiple legends and they have different people and some overlap, at one time is about 60 people, probably, right? 60 people at the very least, where we're at on a day-to-day basis, and those people will move in and out, and sometimes there'll be more and sometimes there'll be less. But I would say at the height it would be 60, at the low it would be 20.
Okay. And what would you say, or what is the production style that you use? What production methodology do you operate?
Okay, so
Waterfall, agile, that kind of.
I would say that we actually work in we work with agile methodology, right? The whole concept of the Scrum and whatnot. We have 2-week sprints, and this was recent with the production team overall. We set the standard that every team, no matter how you structure the content of your sprint, the sprints are always consistent across the entire company. This is a very recent thing with Respawn, specifically in the last 2 to 3 years, which has helped immensely, right? So we have that, but the workflow of items that come in, for the most part, for some teams, are largely Kanban. There is agile aspects to it, in that, like, if something comes up and we need to move something and we need to renegotiate what is ideal, we can do that, right? And we do the retrospectives, we do the burn down charts, et cetera, et cetera. So there isn't really like a methodology, so to speak. And this is actually the most common thing in most of the companies. Like, no one actually sticks to just one way. And if they can stick to one way, that's great, but it's very rare, because there are aspects and time points for each development that it doesn't work. Like, agile doesn't work easily with a live operations game, right? You have to make a lot of calls in such a way that, like, being able to give someone 2 weeks and then only you repivot is quite rare. But you can use it for the prototype, which we do use very heavily during the early parts of when we create a legend, right? Or when we create a new game feature, or when we can create a new mobile game for pitch, right? So those situations, then we use a very, very agile methodology style discipline discussion. And some parts of it look a little waterfall. I would say within the arts teams especially, it's more waterfall, because it goes from one thing to another, which makes sense because they're making asset creations that require sign-offs, and each point is blocked off, right? So that's generally how I would say it's all methodologies, depending on the point in which you are and depending on where your contribution lays. But we do have sprints, so we do have sprint deliverables. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, for context, the game studio, our team size, we expect to be about 100 this fall. So for a student group, that's pretty significant.
Yeah, that's pretty significant.
And we're using Agile Scrum style methodology to be pretty rigorous about doing that.
Yeah.
To make sure everyone understands how that should work. And what you say about, like, yeah, but we also have, Kanban, and we also, in some ways we're doing this thing that's sort of a waterfall style. That, I agree, is very common. I've seen places or studios that are very optimized because of that. And I've seen studios that have a mix of things, and that just means that, like, they're doing it badly and no one is working in the same direction. And the difference is, do you understand why you would use Scrum? Do you understand
Mhm.
what the benefits
Yeah.
are and what's important about it?
Yeah.
And
Does it fit your team is also a really important question people
right.
don't tend to ask,
Yeah.
because sometimes there is a situation where people force Scrum into it because it's kind of an en vogue way to sound like you're having your shit together, but it's a very good way to wreck people too if it's not the if it doesn't help them thrive.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so you talked a little bit about this, but on a typical day in the office,
Mhm.
what does that look like for you? You arrive at the office doors
Mhm.
and you do what for how many hours over the course of a day? Right?
Okay, so often,
Different from day to day, but just
yeah.
a average day.
Yeah. Luckily I don't go into the office anymore, but yeah, a lot of it is get coffee and look at what the emails are. So my day to day is very much, I have a strict adherence nowadays, at the very least, to not answer unless I'm on call after 5:30, and this helps the separation. But that means that certain things can happen because we have teams who are international that come in later in the day, or escalations that happen with different teams that are on call. So the first thing I do is check the emails. I have the thing where I do not like my email inbox to be full because it gives me a bit of anxiety to see a bunch of things come in, right? Make sure that the reports are there. Check in on my action items from the day before. I usually have a list that I separate out of like action items that need follow up for the week or need follow up for the day. And if there are any deadlines that are upcoming that I should check in with the team about. After that, I move into a bunch of stand-ups with different teams, different pods usually. Like sometimes I have it with my game design team and their engineers, and then I check in with the art teams because we have to coordinate a lot of things across different art teams, like the 3D modeling, the mocap studios, our voice actors, et cetera, so on and so forth, right? Checking in on those places and then making sure that on Jira, especially, and Shotgun ShotGrid, pieces are moving and we are seeing updates. This is less vigorous from day to day. It's usually more of like the deliverable, certain things, as we said, with art pipelines. It takes a couple days, and then having a clear idea of that, like mind mapping it to my time frame expectations, makes sense. Oftentimes, what I spend most of my other parts of the day doing is going in and out of meetings with different features. Usually it is a conversation with either game designers or product managers. Product managers, if people are not familiar, are usually people who handle on the business side of aspects that also cover into game design. Depending on which side of the industry you land on, this is applicable. And a lot
Yeah.
of this is negotiating with them on what they require. Right. And so most of my longer meetings are conversations of like, is the requirement written to the expectation that I can bring this to a team so that they can help you size it or ask the right questions for technical execution, so to speak, right? Because a lot of times a request comes in and it's too brief, like it doesn't actually give us any baselines. And a lot of my conversations with the team and my leads is to be like, this is understandable to a degree, but it's too vague, right? It means that we can go off the rails. It's very hard to size. And so before it even touches my team, a lot of the negotiation I'm doing is really on that, right? And then updating whether reports need to go out, checking in my one-on-ones to train my teammates, train different people. I usually have one-on-ones with different leads to make sure that like we get a pulse on the team because we don't get to see their day-to-day all the time, right? Walk around the office to see what's up, update the tickets, update any escalations, checking to see whether bugs came in that are sitting in the backlog that have
Mhm.
been lost to the Maya, because usually you want to check every single day with a live game on something that may be for your direct report, so that you have an understanding of like, is this a problem? Is this not a problem? Right? Because sometimes people may misunderstand it. So this is my day to day for the most part. And then usually by the time I get to the end of the day, I'm usually reassessing that list of what I need to check in with other people and what pieces need to be done, or do we need to renegotiate anything for any different team or timeline changes. Note it to myself and then rinse and repeat, and that's the next day again.
Nice. Yeah. So you said a lot of things that are really important in
Mhm.
there. One thing that I would note is like you work with a really big team. You work with a lot of people.
Mhm.
When we're going to be somewhat smaller,
Mhm.
but still large.
Mhm.
You have and you're working at sort of a second level, largely of
Mhm.
production, where you have other producers who are working at a more granular level with
Mhm.
the teams, saying like, I don't get to see the day-to-day work of my team, right? Or like there's too many tasks, there's too much happening
Mhm.
for you to actually see all that work.
Yeah, and even
And
when I was
so,
a granular producer, I wouldn't see it day to day myself because I'm not the one
right,
executing, right? So even being on the pod, the only reason I see something come in is because they check it in and I'd be able to
yep,
see it. But fundamentally, I don't see every little bit of progress move, right? So this is just one more
yeah.
step removed a little bit.
Right. You mentioned a software package called Jira,
Mhm.
which for students who aren't familiar with it, because many students won't see that till they hit the industry, is a professional level ticketing and organization software. Often integrates with your version control and integrates with project planning. And
Mhm.
when you will be using Trello, which is made by the same company, but it's a free, simplified uh, less ticketing focused, more
More
sprint and task.
visual. Yeah.
But it's where you go to get the task that you're going to be doing,
Mhm.
how you show everyone that you've progressed your tasks, and how those become marked as completed.
Mhm.
So yeah, using that is really important. A lot of the communication between different groups is happening by virtue of the fact that you're interfacing with whatever that project management software is, in
Mhm.
Jira, Trello, that kind of thing, because you don't have time to tell people what you're doing. And certainly the people above and below you aren't going to have visibility on what you're doing. So
Mhm.
that communication is really key. It's a big part of your job, and you need to use tools to support that. One of those tools is also, for if you're using Agile and Scrum, and you're having your sprint rituals and your different meeting types, a lot of the communication happens in those meetings. So for the students, you're not going to see what the other people in your team, let alone the other people across the studio, are doing. For your team, in your sprint meetings, you'll hear what other people on your team are doing. In your sprint review, you'll see the progress they made over the sprint. And then, we use a sprint summary system where team leaders create a brief sprint summary and post it to a thread in our Discord. And then everyone in the studio will be able to go through and read that thread for the sprints each week to have a high level view of what's going on, to try to maintain that level of transparency. But that's one of the biggest challenges as you scale, is creating a system that allows communication up and down that chain.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, so we're coming up on having been at this for half an hour, but I have a bunch of like maybe more rapid
Yeah,
fire
that's rapid fire
questions
questions. Yeah.
that will work out. What's the best thing about being a producer?
You get to see everything if you try at it, because very few aspects of the industry do you ever get to see essentially how the pie is made, and you get to be able to dive with the teams while not actually being a subject matter expert, and being the fly on the wall really gives you a really holistic perspective that very rarely do ICs ever get from that view. So I feel like that's very valuable, because that helps you keep things in perspective when you go back to your work or even in daily life, really.
Cool. And for students, ICs are individual contributors.
Mhm.
So that's people who are producing particular assets and so on. Awesome. What's the worst thing about being a producer?
It is a thankless job oftentimes, because you do have to be you do, as because you have the holistic view, or because you kind of have to crack the whip, so to speak. And coming from a creative background, trying to tell someone to stop polishing something, or like, oh, we don't have to have another iteration, is very difficult, because it actively goes against a creative want, or a completionist perspective, right? But in the end, we do need to be chop chop, right? And so managing those expectations do not come kindly sometimes, because it is also managing people's expectations and their personalities, and there are 60 hundreds of people, right? So that becomes challenging oftentimes, and not the funnest part of the conversation to have from the day to day.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of the work is management
Yeah.
focused. And you also said something I think that's important, and that not all producers, I feel like, always realize. I'm managing a bunch of people and I'm not a subject expert in that area.
Mhm.
And that's something that you see a lot. And so having a producer who has that high level view and is able to facilitate your work, but also understands that they're not actually an expert in the thing you're doing, and listens up to the feedback of the people that they're managing is important. And
Mm-hmm.
you're not always going to have that, right? Like I
Yeah.
certainly had a number of very effective in terms of like doing project management mechanics, project managers who believed that they understood what I was doing.
Yeah.
As a designer or as a programmer, and would insist upon being things being their way, or make decisions based on their lack of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be very frustrating. So
Yes.
for those of you who do go into production, stay humble. For those of you who don't, work with your producers to help them understand what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool. What would you say to yourself as a student if you could go back and talk to yourself as you were entering school, right? And you're like, I've decided to study game design,
Mm-hmm.
or game development in some capacity, and I'm walking into the university campus like my freshman year, or if it was a
Mm-hmm.
graduate program, the beginning of the program, and you get to walk up to your younger self and be like, so here's the stuff you need to focus on, or this thing you think is really important actually isn't. What would you say to yourself?
Oh, the very first thing I tell myself is get therapy. Like, and I really mean this in not, and it sounds not amazing, but it's quite true, because a lot of the industry is difficult. And I think the difficulty when you, especially if you're an undergraduate, I was very lucky that when I entered, I was already in my late 20s, but I already struggled with a lot of anxiety, depression, and the industry unfortunately sort of preys on that. And therapy will help you be more well adjusted to the times when things are bad, even especially when you're job hunting, and also in the career itself, the anxiety of having to perform, right? And having a good baseline of knowing how to handle that would have helped so much, especially in school too. Because so much of the passing in school is that the second part I definitely be is like, don't be so rigid in believing that you only have one way, right? I think part of my pressure as an immigrant was very much like, you have only so many options. And that is some cases for some people, but quite frankly, you never know where life takes you. Like, I can say now, what I say nowadays is very much hindsight, not foresight, right? And pretending like I have foresight was very difficult and very hard on myself when I didn't understand that there were many aspects to the industry that I just didn't really understand. I was not as critical. That's just really swear. Not critical as in you have to be hard on yourself. You should be critical in that you should try and question what you take for granted and you take as gospel, because that
Yeah.
is what will help you grow the most. Because oftentimes you are probably more in perception bias with your groups and your preferences than you believe, and that can be a limiting factor. And once you step away from that, it actually opens your mind to the possibilities of, if you do continue with whatever track that you have, with the help of therapy as well, you will thrive much more than thriving on the terrible fear of losing everything.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that the mental health is hugely important, and it's dealt with really poorly in the industry by and large. There's companies that are exceptions, but the fact that the amount of pressure that the game development cycle can put, and live ops can put on developers, is intense. And there's not always a lot of scaffolding around that. So having your own self-care, having your own therapist, like having that be part of your life, right, is critical to being able to succeed and thrive and not burn out or not end up like with severe depression. You were talking about, especially when job hunting, the industry's unstable and you'll lose your job. And I know developers who, have struggled with suicide, have struggled with severe depression,
Many people.
because of being, suddenly like being fired, because a project was canceled, or, because of a toxic work environment. And having that scaffolding around you is really important. And if it sounds a little bit scary for us to be sitting here and telling you, students, that if you want to get in this industry, you're signing up for a lifetime of therapy just to get by and stay healthy, that's what this is like, right? This is not, there are costs to what we decide to do. And that's important to know. And the second thing that I think I agree with, like that I would have said to myself going into my first job, was I assumed that the people who were my bosses always knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
If they made a call that seemed nonsensical to me or went against my understanding of design, I was sort of like, well, I mean, they have the experience, they know what they're talking about. And it turned out like, no, they're younger than I am now, and they were making it up as they went. And like, not everything they did was foolish, right? But they weren't getting the feedback and the questioning of their decisions that would have been useful for them. So question the people who tell you to do things. Be respectful. They do have experience. That does matter. But question and learn how to do that in a way that is productive, because going in and just like calling BS on your boss in a big meeting, like that's not really necessarily going to make things better. So finding a way that is appropriate to provide that upstream feedback about decisions, especially if you're the subject matter expert and the person who's either your project manager or your boss doesn't have that expertise. Very important.
Yep.
What would you say to yourself on your first day in a production position where you just made that transition and you're going into this new position, but you've never done it before? What would be the thing that you would say?
I would say it's an expansion of the stay humble, right? It is more that be inquisitive, not in a, I think that depending, and this is where the therapy helps, right? Depending on your upbringing or your surroundings, a lot of people struggle with this. I struggle with it a lot because it is something that is commonly punished in many of my culture people, right? But being inquisitive is what helps you talk to the subject matter experts, right? Because a lot of times what you're going to run into is that if you are so lucky to come from a different aspect of the industry, you'll understand that aspect. But for example, I came from a creative industry. Talking to software engineers is very different. The way the mind works there is completely different. And what your job is in the end is to find the layman terms and help them break it down, right? So being inquisitive, genuinely inquisitive, while also doing your own research is, while that sounds like common sense, is actually not very common. People do take a lot of things for granted, and you will be rewarded for that space when you start growing into the industries, because it's very hard. Like, as I said, I did core tech and all these things. None of that makes any sense to me at some point. There is a level I understand, and there's a level where I'm like, all right, this is not necessary. Part of the reason why you want to be inquisitive is because at some point the industry is commonly extremely overwhelming, and there comes a point you do need to cap it off for your own mental health. You do not need to deep dive that far, right? And learning that line. You can't know
everything that goes into making a game. It's more than there is room for in any human brain, no matter how good you are. And if you're working in an indie studio alone, it doesn't mean you understand everything that happens to a game. It just means the games you're making are more limited.
Also, the one final thing on that is keep receipts. And by receipts, I mean, like, if you have meeting notes, even on one-on-ones, you should send emails as a follow-up of like what that is, because a lot of times people tend to leave that in the wayside, and that causes a lot of problems. It's also self-protection, because you want to make sure that there is an agreement of like, these are the things we agreed to, these are the things that we said we action upon, etc., etc., and those are valuable, not just to use for your safety, but also for your sanity of mind when you have to go check.
Right. Yep. Keeping detailed records, if you're using a system like Jira and you get an email that requires that you change a task or update a task, you want to be, adding that to the task so that that's recorded. If you go into a meeting and you have changed requirements, you need to send an email saying, hey, this is what we said. You probably are going to be talking to whoever's doing the project management system. You may or may not be creating tickets on your own, but like, it might be, I need to create a change request ticket because of this meeting, or it might be, I need to talk to my scrum master, or I need to talk to the department head, or whoever's going to be doing that, to make sure that all of those requirements are captured. So much of game design at a large scale is about organization and not about like individual contributor content production, right? The more contributors you have sort of an exponential scaling of the scaffolding necessary to allow them to work. And that's what you'll be seeing in the studio this semester. Awesome. So any quick closing thoughts, and then we'll wrap this up. I think we'll be talking to you again in the future, but for production, we'll be wrapping this up. So
okay. So my closing thoughts is really like, please do prioritize your mental health. Like, the major thing that has been difficult with the industries is a lot of people leave because of that lack of support for themselves or the people around them for mental health, because the industry is very not just unstable, but very demanding when you are so passionate. Like, find ways to still be passionate. Another major thing, please have a life away from your career. It will save you. Like, you need to do things more than this one thing, or it will drown you, because you need something aside from this career to keep thriving in it, right? And perhaps the last thing is really be mindful in a space where we, post BLM and everything, and even before that we should have been, you need to keep your mind open and have people teach you new things, and that your worldview will always be changing. I think the biggest toxicity in the industry is that oftentimes it is led by people who believe their worldview to be right, even if their worldview is many years behind, which is why we have the joke of boomers or whatever, right? Is because there is a rigidity of thought that comes with that then bleeds itself into the industry. So if you love the games industry and you want to come in there and you want to thrive in it, this is one way to add new flavor that I think younger students especially still have extreme flexibility to understand how to be more open-minded to those conversations. Don't feel like it's that you're stupid. Everyone's stupid, like, quite frankly. No one is smart, right? And thrive in the fact that you will always keep learning, right? Like, you will not go out and be a subject matter expert and then you're like, oh, I know everything. Like, no, like, Photoshop's going to update Creative Suite and then you're going to have your control not be control and your transform not be transform, stuff like that, right? And you need to be flexible to understand when to question changes in the industry that are good and when to question when changes in the industry are bad. And that will help you thrive and also be a great asset to the industry overall.
Yeah, we need new
Blood.
ideas, understanding of both technology, design ideas, and the way society is changing. That needs to get reflected in the industry in ways that it's been slow to respond to and adopt. We should probably talk a bit more later about diversity in the industry and workplace toxicity and like the social justice aspects of being a game designer. I think you have a lot to say about that, and maybe we can revisit that later. But it's through the idealism of new designers that we're able to shift things. So welcome everyone, and if this hasn't scared you away from being a game designer, maybe you're making the right choice. Awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem.
And we'll talk.